Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're joining us from today. Thank you very much for joining the Climate Action Tracker's virtual event on how green is the recovery. We know it's a very busy week, and we very much appreciate you taking the time to join us today for this event. I have with me 4 panelists today. My name is Claire Stockwell. I'm a Senior Climate Policy Analyst at Climate Analytics, and I will be your moderator. With me from the Climate Analytics side, I have our CEO, Mr. Bill Hare, as well as the Climate Policy Team Lead, Deborah Ramalope. On the New Climate side, we are joined by Nicholas Huna, who is a founding partner there, as well as the lead on the Climate Action Tracker, Sofia Gonzalez. So we hope to keep the presentations today to about 30 minutes in length. Bill will start us off with an introduction of the Climate Action Tracker. This will be followed by Nicholas, who will walk through some of the developments that have taken place this year, as well as what they mean for emissions. Sophia will then walk us through the analysis that we have done on the recovery packages in 5 major economies. And then Deborah will close out the session talking about the latest temperature update that we released earlier today. And then we will have a Q&A session. Now, I'm sure by this point in the year, you are all masters at Zoom, but we thought we would just give you a quick reminder that to ask us questions today, please do so in the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of the screen. There's no need to wait until the end of the presentations. Please ask them whenever they come to mind. And if you do see them disappear, don't worry, that's just because we've put them on the stack to be put to the panelists. And we will try and get through as many of those questions as possible. We've also disabled the chat function just to make the lines of the communication easier. And a final note is that we are recording this session and that it will be available on our website soon after the event closes. Now, before I turn things over to Bill, I just did want to make a note that the 4 panelists that you're seeing today are about a fraction of the Climate Action Tracker team. We've got a number of people working diligently in the background to make sure this event runs smoothly, as well as had a whole host of people contribute to the analysis that we're going to present to you today. So my thanks to them, and with that, I will pass it over to Bill. Bill, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Next slide, please, Claire. Yeah, look, thanks and welcome to the Climate Action Trackers event, virtual event for the New York Climate Week. First time we've ever done this virtually, of course, but I just wanted to introduce you quickly to the scope of what the Climate Action Tracker does. I guess many of you are familiar that we do assessments of what the collective actions of countries mean in terms of global mean warming. We have a famous thermometer. But in addition to that, the Climate Action Tracker is doing a lot more. As you'll see a bit later, we've done an analysis of the COVID-19 response, but we also focus on assessing countries, commitments, and actions individually, so that we're able to show how countries are tracking in terms of their commitments and policy actions towards the Paris Agreement goals. We also look in some detail at how decarbonisation work is tracking and look at real progress in the real economies of different countries. We've also looked at the preparedness of countries for climate policy governance as well. And at present, we have a bit of work going on tracking how countries are improving or not their NDCs. Countries are meant to be updating their NDCs with more ambition by 2020. Timetable a bit delayed by COVID, but we're following that. And we've also looked in some detail at the scaling up opportunities across different countries. Claire, the next slide, please. Yeah, so looking at the country actions, we've been working on this now essentially since 2009, working out what countries are doing, what they're proposing, and how that stacks up against the Paris Agreement pathways. I'm not going to take you through this in detail, but it comes up with a way of comparing countries nationally determined contributions, the sum of their domestic actions and climate finance together. Gives you an overview of where countries are going or need to go with respect to the Paris Agreement target. Claire, next slide, please. At present, we're looking at what countries are doing in terms of proposing new targets. We've categorized countries in different ways here on this map, showing which countries are actually not planning to update their targets, which countries have submitted and which countries are proposing new targets. At this stage of the game, more of the map is covered with countries that have not yet updated their target with a stronger one. I do note, however, that Japan has signaled that it plans to update its NDC next year, hopefully with more ambition, so we may be able to change that country's category. But this gives you an overview for the countries we track. We have a fair bit of detail on this website that I think is very useful, and for others that we don't track, we just simply note and provide links to the source of their announcements as they are. Next slide, please, Claire. In addition to this work I've mentioned, we are also trying to track decarbonisation. Recently, we prepared a report on Paris Agreement compatible sectoral benchmarks across a range of different countries, including the largest emitters. And this is a figure from that recent publication where we looked at power, transport, heavy industry, and buildings. On the bottom left of this figure is the renewable share in power generation by country, looking at a range of different data sources to work out where countries need to be, given their starting points on the carbon intensity of their power sector, to where they need to be 2030, 2040, 2050. Corresponding analysis also for domestic transport for the same set of countries, giving you what we hope are policymakers, stakeholders, business, others, a snapshot of where sectors in their countries need to be going in order to be Paris Agreement compatible. So that's one of the key products of the CAT that's bringing together work over the last years. I think it's going to be, and I know is very valuable for many in the community. So next slide, please. Going forward, Claire. So now I hand over to Nicholas to deal with the unexpected character of 2020 and what the CAT has looked at in that context. Nicholas,
thanks a lot, Bill. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, Nicholas Höhne here at New Climate Institute, part of the Climate Action Tracker team, which we said already is a large team, so we are only speaking on behalf of that full team. So unexpected events this year, I have two. One is that it came yesterday, which was the announcement by China to strive for carbon neutrality before 2060. There was an announcement at the UN General Assembly. It came together with an announcement to scale up the 2030 NDC target and to urge countries to promote green recovery. This is an announcement and it still needs to be implemented, but we still think it is quite significant because it would mean that the world's largest emitter would phase out conventional coal, oil, and gas by 2060 completely. And that was something that was completely unthinkable only 5 years ago. So if this announcement is really then taken through, it would be a complete game changer, because if a quarter of global emissions is going that way, that is quite a bit. And not only so, we now also have announcements by the EU, that's more from the Commission, a proposal to also update their 2030 NDC from 40 to 55%, and to the aim to go climate neutral by 2050. So we now have EU and China together promoting net zero emissions, so phasing out completely coal, oil, and gas by mid-century. And we would hope, well, they together covered 33% of global emissions. We would hope that they together can now create that momentum for a race to the top. If you add all other countries that have made similar announcements wanting to go to net zero targets or carbon or climate neutrality, then we count 126 countries now and 51% of global emissions. That's a huge number, and that is really different to what we have seen before. All with the caveat that these are announcements and countries need to implement them, but at least that's what it is. If you then even count on top of that, that also the president candidate Joe Biden has in his election campaign a net zero target, and if he would become president and would pull it through, then we would be at 63% globally. And if we would be in that situation, I would think that also the remaining countries have no other choice to move in the same direction. So that makes us very hopeful in that regard. What it means for temperature, we'll hear later from Deborah. The second unexpected thing is the COVID pandemic. And this is from our previous briefing, where we said there's basically two things. One is economy is down, emissions are down, but if the economy is up, emissions will go up again and we are back where we were before. What we really need is green recovery. And in this slide, you can see that if we are able to invest 1.2% of GDP globally per year in green activities, then we could be on a pathway towards 1.5 degrees. So 1.2% of GDP additionally would be necessary globally and each year. And if you compare that to the economic stimulus packages that are being agreed now by countries, this seems to be in the order of magnitude of what's possible because large sums of money are being transferred. So much the theory. Whether countries are really doing that, that comes in the next session. So over to you, Sophia, to tell us what countries are really doing.
Exactly. Thank you, Niklas. And indeed, now we're going to have a closer look at the economic recovery plans for 5 selected countries. Next slide, thank you. Yeah. So yeah, here at the Climate Action Tracker, we have assessed the status of these COVID-19 economic recovery measures announced by these 5 countries. We have China, the EU, India, South Korea, and the US. This comparative analysis across the countries provides insights on the magnitude of these activities and also the level of greenness that we have for them. As of August 2020, we have analyzed 106 national measures across the countries, including both announced and implemented measures. And we have divided them into 2 groups. So we have overarching packages, like the first row that you see in this table, and then we have the individual interventions. The overarching packages represent aggregated rescue and recovery announcements. So they're basically composed of several other concrete measures. Not all of them are directly impacting emissions. And then we have the individual interventions. These are exactly those, the concrete and quantifiable measures within an overarching package, for example, and that can have a direct impact in emissions or not. So we have, like you see there in the table, you have on the right side those that do not directly impact emissions, and then on the left side we have the carbon-related ones that should have either an increase or a reduction of emissions. Next slide, please. Thanks. So we then further categorize these measures to see the level of greenness. And for this, we had expert judgment to look into each one of these measures, and we classify them as follows. So you see the green measures, those are the ones that support or trigger investments in low carbon technologies. We have yellow measures, which are those that have no direct impact on emissions, the ones I was referring to before, for example, those supporting the healthcare system of the country. Then we have red measures that are basically those that are supporting the unsustainable business as usual or investments on carbon intensive technologies. And finally, we of course have measures where we simply do not have enough information to judge what will be the potential impact on emissions when implemented. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. And now jumping to the results directly, we first look into the overarching packages. And then we see that the volume of public finance that has been announced and committed for this recovery varies quite a lot. It goes between 8 to 10% of the GDP for EU, India, and South Korea, and it goes up to even 14% of the GDP in the case of the US and China. As we can see, there is a large share of these packages that is considered neutral. That means that is not directly impacting emissions, and it's highlighted in yellow in this graph. This refers mostly to short-term rescue measures such as healthcare support or social spending. And one example is India's first rescue package, which was focused basically on cash transfers for low-income households, insurance coverage for workers in the health sector, and things around that topic. Another large share of the packages is now colored as uncleared, and this is showed as a combination of either red and green measures in the bars, or we also have yellow and red stripes. So this means that we do not have at this moment enough information to know in which direction these plans can go once implemented. What is very clear from this graph is that it is only South Korea and the EU that have until today communicated an explicit focus on green recovery, at least for parts of their recovery packages. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. And now looking into the individual interventions. So just to remind everyone, then these interventions only account for a smaller portion of the overarching packages that we just saw on the previous slide. They can be ranging between 0.5 and 2.5% of the GDP. And what we see when we look at these concrete measures, it's a rather mixed picture. So we have, for most countries, they have all announced or implemented both green and red measures. There is a significant lack of information regarding the financial volumes of these measures, but overall the picture is that those red interventions are generally getting a larger share of the GDP compared to those green interventions. Now, to some highlights on a country-by-country basis, we have China that has several green individual interventions this year, but the specific composition and details of some of the plans, for example, the new infrastructure plan, which entails between 1.4 and 2.5 trillion US dollars, remains unclear. And this makes our assessment, it's still like it has a large part that it's undefined. Then we have the EU that has announced to devote 30% of the overarching package to green climate related spending, but there remains uncertainty about that other 70% and how it will be spent. Although there are certain conditions like the do no harm under environmental conditions. We still need more information to judge in which direction it will go. And here we would like to then make the disclaimer that we didn't look into any announcements or measures proposed by individual EU member states. We just looked at those proposed and adopted by the European Council. In the case of India, the most recent announcements are more going into the carbon intensive direction. So, for example, promoting more than 40 new domestic coal mines with private investment. And there's only very few and rather low impact green measures that are being proposed. For South Korea, the government has announced more green individual interventions than red. So in terms of number of announcements and measures, we have more green ones. But when we looked at the percentage of GDP that's being allocated to each one, it seems like there is more money going into the red interventions than to the green ones. And finally, the US, so the government has not attached any green strings to the large volume of rescue package, so the entire bar of the 14% of GDP. doesn't have any link or conditions to climate. And the US government is instead using the pandemic to roll back several environmental regulations, while green recovery interventions remain almost completely absent. Next slide, thanks Claire. Yeah, and while we were doing this analysis, we also started then realizing that that these countries are, these key emitters are taking different approaches in their early recovery practices. We have also collected several examples of do's and don'ts that we found while we were looking into these countries, and we also looked into other countries. So this part is not limited to the 5 countries that we mentioned before. But this basically only re-emphasizes the range of green measures that governments have at their disposal to design their economic recovery plans. However, it also highlights that the governments have already implemented numerous carbon-intensive measures. Here, I'm just presenting a selection of examples that we've looked into for different countries and for different sectors. And I'm gonna just mention a few of them for the sake of time, but we have a full list in our briefing paper. So yeah, regarding the power sector, it's very good to highlight in the case of China and South Korea that both the governments are increasing the support for developments in solar and wind energy. And then on the contrary, we have India, which is currently accelerating commercial coal mining. For the transport sector, it's very positive to hear that China is planning to significantly expand their electric vehicle charging network this year. But on the other side, we also have tax reductions for both China and South Korea for purchasing second-hand cars in the case of China without any conditions related to efficiency. And then for car manufacturers in the case of South Korea, again, without any green conditions to it. In the sector of aviation, which is one that's very prominent in the news, we have Austria and France that have provided bailout for their national airlines, but this was linked to several climate conditions, such as increasing efficiency or reducing the short distance flights. And then on the other side, we have the US and South Korea who are again providing bailout, but in this case with no conditions. And finally, well, for the land use sector, South Korea's Green New Deal has a component that looks specifically into terrestrial and marine ecosystem restoration. Well, we have in the other extreme, Brazil's government currently deregulating land use in the Amazon to stimulate economic activity in the country. With all of these examples, what we find is that there are some positive intentions overall, but the governments are yet to seize this moment to green the recovery packages. And we are still missing some leadership in terms of going green in the recovery for COVID-19. And with this, I hand over to my colleague, Deborah.
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks, Sophia. So you've heard what countries are doing and how are they investing their recovery packages, and some of the opportunities that are available to countries in terms of do's and don'ts, the last slide that Sophia presented. So the question now that I'm going to present, try and respond to, is what does all this mean for emissions and temperature increases? So overall, the message is that COVID emissions impact will have very little effect on warming. And our analysis shows that emissions will drop by between 5 and 9% below 2019 levels, with emissions likely to be lower in 2030 compared to the pre-COVID levels. And this is not because of any deliberate shifts on countrysides or governments taking deliberate actions to shift or to decarbonize their economies or any structural changes. And we don't see this sustaining itself beyond the COVID unless countries decide otherwise to invest their recovery packages in green interventions. So what does all this mean for temperatures? So we have done an assessment of what's going to be the impact on temperature. And if you look at the diagram there, you see the bar on the right, which talks to the temperature increases when it comes to current policies, and the one on your left talks directly to the pledges and targets that countries have submitted in their NDCs. So our assessment shows that the implementation of current policies will lead to about 2.9 degree temperature rise by end of the century. This is 0.1 lower than our last assessment, which you may have seen presented in December in Madrid. As you can see, this is not sufficient. It's definitely not taking us in the right direction. And if you look at the impact of current NDC targets, this will lead to a warming of about 2.7 degrees by end of the century. And with China's recent announcement, we expect a further 0.2 to 0.3 degrees less, which will land us at around 2.4 to 2.5 degrees. Next slide, Claire. Okay, so in addition to temperature assessments, we also do an assessment of expected absolute emissions in, for instance, 2020, 2025, and 2030, and compare this with benchmark pathways for meeting 1.5 Paris Agreement goal. Note this is only for the countries that we track. And as you would have seen in Bill's presentation, in the map that he presented there on the NDC tracker, only a few countries have updated their NDCs, mostly without the necessary ambition that we really need to meet the 1.5 temperature goal. And as you can see, the arrow in green, the one to your right, it shows a substantial gap that still remains. Even with COVID, that's not dented. For 2030, we have a gap of about between 23 to 27 gigatons for us to be able to reach the 1.5. If we really want to get to that temperature goal, then that's the gap that we need to bridge, basically. No surprises there again, given that most of the targets are not ambitious as we had expected, that 2020 countries will be delivering on more ambitious targets. Next slide, Claire. Okay, we have recently updated 13 countries. If you go on the CAT website, you can see the countries that we've just updated now. And I'm just going to highlight a few examples. Mainly starting, if you look at the list that we have, those three there, it's countries with massive appetite for fossil fuels. If you look at Australia, for instance, at the top, Australia has no intentions to update its targets. This is also a country that lacks climate change policy direction and continues to invest in fossil fuels, particularly gas, and they also continue to support coal. And as we have seen, that is also the picture that is reflected in Australia's recovery package, which also missed the opportunity to invest in low carbon interventions. Moving on to Indonesia, another country with massive support for coal. Indonesia is the fourth largest has the fourth largest coal pipeline, just after China, India, and Turkey. And its economic recovery plan was also mainly focused around bailing out coal utilities, which is clearly against what is required. I mean, the assessment that we have done last year that shows that globally we need to phase out coal by 2040. So it's definitely going in the opposite direction. Russia, not a surprise there. In its new energy strategy for 2035, Russia continues to promote fossil fuel expansion. And it's not only at domestic level, but it continues to do that for export markets as well. Next slide, Claire. Mexico. So Mexico not only lacks ambition in its low carbon development, we also see that there's massive rollbacks in terms of policies in Mexico. It has recently passed several bills to stop investments in renewable energies, which is a setback, definitely, and basically favoring fossil fuels. So that's another country going the opposite direction. But, so as bad as it sounds, we have one or two promising countries, and the EU is one of those. So although its target is not Paris compatible yet, the EU is giving some good signals, definitely, and clearly stands out in comparison to the rest, and particularly those that we have recently assessed. Looking at its recent proposal of 55% target, I think it's heading in the right direction. And I hope it's an example that some of the countries can try and emulate going forward to try and change direction and go in the same direction as the EU. Next slide, Claire. Okay, we have Saudi Arabia. As you would know, Saudi Arabia is the current G20 president. And just as a reminder, by the way, G20 had a commitment, or they had a decision taken over 10 years ago to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. And however, what we're seeing now with the current president who's completely going against that decision, Saudi has announced further subsidies for fossil fuel generated electricity, and that announcement was done around April 2020. So, and the other thing that we also seen in the analysis of Saudi is that it has a very ambitious renewable energy target, but very little action to meet that target, which also gets to the point that you can have the most ambitious target and still not implement it. So it's not only about the targets that you have, but the action that also matters a lot, that will take us to the 1.5 pathway. And then lastly, the UK, as the incoming COP president, you can get the details on the CAD website. We've also done a detailed analysis or assessment of UK. And I think there's an opportunity for the UK to lead by example. And they also have this opportunity to submit a very ambitious NDC target for 2030. And I think that would be setting a good example as the incoming COP president for COP26. Next slide, Claire. Okay, what are some of the key messages? So to sum up the whole presentation, so the overall picture is not looking good. I'm sure you would have seen that in all our presentations from Bill, Nicholas, and Sophia's slides as well. It's mainly dominated by interventions that are not contributing to the transition to low carbon economies or societies, and with very few green interventions, as we would have seen in Sophia's presentation. We have also noted that some countries are using this pandemic to move backwards, basically. You see, and we have highlighted a few countries there, that are either continuing to support fossil fuels or rolling back policies that basically meant well in terms of the transition or the transformations required. But there are countries who are going in the opposite direction, and you would see some of the countries there, Australia, South Africa, Indonesia, Russia, all those are just examples of. And we, as I indicated earlier on, there are those who are heading in the right direction. And the two examples that we have, it's EU and South Korea. And then given all these developments, our temperature assessments, as I've indicated earlier on, shows that COVID emissions impact will have little long-term effect. But I think the recent announcement by China and the EU on carbon neutrality, the EU by 2050 and China before 2060 are likely to flip the situation. And I guess that gives a bit of hope, or a little bit of good news there, given all what we have seen in the analysis, with the majority of countries basically not being that ambitious. And so far, few countries officially updated their indices, as we would have seen in that map that Bill presented. And a number of large countries have also made announcements that they will not be updating their indices or even presenting more ambitious indices, which is a little bit worrying. Lastly, I think the main point here, as we would have noted, that the picture is not that great, obviously. Countries still not implementing the necessary structural or transformational changes required to meet the Paris Agreement temperature goal. And most are still continuing to miss this opportunity. I think the COVID recovery packages have presented the opportunity, and many countries have decided not to grab that and invest in low carbon or implement green interventions with their recovery packages. That's it from me, thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Deborah, for that summary. And thanks to all the participants. We've had a very lively Q&A throughout the presentation, so we've got lots of questions, and we will do our best to get to as many of them as possible. We did get a couple on how we calculated the 1.2 GDP figure in our earlier analysis, to get to a 1.5 degree pathway as what we needed to have the greenest recovery possible. So I was wondering, Nicholas, if you could maybe walk us through how we got to that figure and its implications. That would be great.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the question. We looked at, for that analysis, we looked at a range of modeling results that are calculating 2-degree and 1.5-degree compatible trajectories. And in these modeling results, they always report how much money is invested in green technologies or green things. And from that, we see that already today, around 1% of global GDP is invested in green infrastructure and green technologies. And that if these scenarios that are designed to meet 1.5 degrees, it's around 1.2% more invested in green than is invested otherwise. So this number is coming from modeling exercises, and you can take it as any modeling exercise as an indication of what it is. It won't be exactly 1.2%, but it's the order of magnitude that is important, which I think 1.2% additional each country globally each year is still absolute quite a lot of money. But again, if you compare that to the recovery packages, which all in all are sometimes in the order of 14% GDP, only one time and only for some countries, we are still in some of an order of magnitude that's relevant here.
Great, thanks so much, Nicholas. We had a couple of questions on China. So the first of which being, how realistic is China's carbon neutrality goal given its reliance on coal? And does its pledge say anything about whether it will stop financing coal overseas? I was wondering, Bill, if you'd like to respond to that one.
Yes, yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a very good question. Obviously, China's announcement is a proposal. But one thing we do know and have learned about Chinese announcements are that they are usually made with the intent of actually achieving them. In our experience, China very rarely makes announcements of changes in policies or improvements unless it's confident it will move towards the achievement of that. And I think that's one reason that one can have some feeling that politically China could well be moving to a commitment in this area. It's a good question about coal because in the last year or so, increasing concerns have been asked about China's trajectory on coal. I think the recent announcements seem to indicate that that might be turning around. We know from other economies that phasing out coal can happen relatively quickly. China will need to come forward and show convincingly how it's to be done, but we believe that analytically it's possible. In relation to China's financing of coal and other carbon-intensive infrastructure overseas, this is a really big issue, as it has been for other big countries actually. But we do know that there's been a significant increase in the share of renewable energy investments in the Belt and Road Initiative countries, and that gives some ground to think that things could improve, but it's definitely something that will have to be watched, and we will be looking at that.
Great, thanks very much, Bill. There was a second question on China, which was the announcement yesterday was about carbon neutrality and not climate neutrality, and how, if we could comment on how big the difference between that is. I was wondering, Nicholas, if you could take that one.
Yeah, thank you. And with all these announcements, one has to be very, very careful what's exactly written. So indeed, it's carbon neutrality, so it covers only CO2. And not the non-CO2 greenhouse gases. The EU announcement is climate neutrality, so covers all greenhouse gases. That's the difference. So for China right now, non-CO2 emissions are around 10% of their total emissions, and we know much less about them. We think that they are increasing, and there are much less policies on them right now. So already until 2030, that share will go up to at least 20%, because CO2 emissions are kind of stagnating. We're not sure whether they really stabilize or not, but that's where they are. But non-CO2 greenhouse gases are still increasing. So their share is relatively low right now, but it will become more important in the future. And And we have assumed when we put down this temperature estimate that also the non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions will be reduced much later than CO2, but they will be reduced. So that's in there already. But as for both CO2 and non-CO2, there's significantly more policies that need to be implemented for this to be happening, especially on non-CO2, because their policy making is far behind in comparison to the CO2 emissions.
Great, thank you, Nicholas. The next question, you'll have to excuse me, I'm having a bit of technical difficulties seeing it, but if I remember from memory, it was about the pandemic and the impact that the pandemic had on NDCs. I was wondering whether, Deborah, you wanted to take that one?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's also about who will be submitting NDCs in the near future. I think what we have observed, and I think given the low number of countries that have submitted their updated NDCs, I think COVID has generally had a delaying effect on most of the countries. We know some countries are still working on their NDCs, and although some countries had planned to submit in 2020, some are not going to submit in 2020, which is worrying, because obviously the delay in the COP cannot mean delayed action or strengthening of the NDCs. But the one example that I can mention from the top of my head is, for instance, Japan has mentioned that they will be submitting a more ambitious NDC next year. So, yeah.
Yeah, and if I can complement from that, we've seen from other experiences also working together with countries that in general, when the NDC process is somehow formalized, then it's less delayed than when it's not as institutionalized. So like in general, yeah, we have different levels of speed in reacting to it. Thanks. Okay, I can help Claire now for a minute, looking at some questions. So I have here one. It's, how do you estimate the size of the measures when explicit information was not given, and whether we have some explanation for that? Nicholas, not sure if you can take this one.
Yeah, I'm happy to explain. So when you look at recovery packages, they're usually termed in terms of money, how much money is going for something. And that's what we then count in terms of money. But as we've seen, there's a lot of rollbacks, for example, or other measures that you can't really count in terms of money. And then we have not counted them in terms of money. We have looked at them as individual actions and have looked at their impact as well. So rollbacks in climate policy, for example, less tight emission standards for cars, for example, or lower regulation or not enforcing regulation, that we counted as individual action, but we don't have a monetary value, so we didn't create one.
Great. Not sure if Claire, you're back. Otherwise, I just throw one more. All right. Yeah. So there's another question. Says, regarding COVID recovery, are there also interventions that increase emissions? And there we have a couple of examples. Bill, I don't know if you want to start. Maybe I can complement afterwards.
Yes. There are quite a few examples, actually, of countries that are, in a sense, doing the wrong thing and are essentially enhancing fossil fuel emissions, either absolutely or increasing them more than they would otherwise have decreased. So Australia is one example where the government is focusing on a gas-led recovery and putting public money into further development of gas resources, pipelines, possibly even a power station fired by gas and other carbon-intensive activities. There are other countries that are providing bailouts for coal, such as Indonesia, for example. Other countries are slowing down environmental measures, such as car standards. and others are investing in infrastructure that is ready to be started, so-called shovel ready, in order to stimulate jobs, but has a long-term negative implications for carbon intensity. So there's quite a few examples, and Sophia, I think you've got a few as well from some of your countries.
Yes, exactly. A couple of them come to mind. Some were already mentioned by Deborah, but yeah, to give a bit more detail, we have, for example, Mexico, and they are rolling back certain policies, like, for example, canceling the renewable energy auction. It was a process that took a long time to start. It was already starting to move ahead, and then now it was cancelled in the context of the pandemic. And then there is a lot of support given to the national fossil fuel state-owned companies. So in that sense, yes, like this type of interventions that are being developed in the framework of COVID are effectively, or could effectively, increase emissions. It's the same for Brazil, and their new policies now promoting economic activity, which basically means less regulations for logging or mining in the Amazon. Yeah. All right, and then to continue with questions, here I have one. What is meant by economic impact of pandemic alone? I'm so sorry. What is meant by economic impact of the pandemic alone has little long-term effect on warming. So what does it mean when we say that the pandemic has a little effect in the long-term warming? Niklas, do you want to take this?
I'm happy if.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, so what we mean by that is that if the economy is down, that's what happened this year, basically, then emissions are down. If the economy is going up again, then emissions are up again. It's only a delay of increased emissions. And that delay is so small in the terms of the climate system, which we are thinking about the next 100 years, that it has very little effect on global temperature by the end of the century. So we basically assume economy down, emissions down. If they're up again, and only we have a delayed increase. And that's basically one effect. There are other effects, which are economic recovery, which basically do a transformation, which change things significantly. Those are the things that we need to look for. And that's why we focus our analysis here on the economic recovery packages, to see whether that has happened. And we see this mixed picture, and we have not fully yet integrated that in our emission estimates. So the emission estimates that you see on global level and for individual countries on the Climate Action Tracker website, there you can look for all the 36 countries, what we think the future emissions are. There we have included the economic downturn and then the slow recovery, the effect of that on the greenhouse gas emissions, and not yet to a full extent the recovery packages, but as you see, they are difficult to analyze, and we will do that as much as we can in the future.
Great, thank you. And now I have another question. So the China announcement and the possibility that Biden could be elected in the US sound like some of the big potential drivers for lower carbon direction. What other one or two things would you like to see that would most contribute to move in this direction? Any volunteers? Bill, Niklas, Deborah?
Happy to take it as well, but go ahead, Bill. Go.
Well, yeah, it's a good question from Laurie. The China announcement, the Biden election, plus the EU policies would really begin to put the world, if the policies were followed through for zero emissions by around 2050, would really get us closer, or very close, to a 1.5 degree pathway, but not quite. There'd still be a long way to go. So what would need to happen is that the other countries, the larger emitters that are left out of that, would really need to step up. Countries in Latin America, India, and so on, will really need to be following suit to consolidate what would be a very strong direction towards meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. So at the country level, would really need a political commitment to follow the lead of the three big countries we've just mentioned, should the US join the game following a Biden victory. On the technology front, clearly the consolidation of the apparent moves towards phasing out coal would need to accelerate and deepen, and there would need to be a political understanding about the early curtailment and phase out of natural gas, backed by renewable energy and other cleaner technologies that would really consolidate these initiatives that would put us in the right way.
Maybe I can quickly add, I was at an expert meeting a week ago or so, and we were saying, okay, imagine the situation that China goes carbon neutral, makes an announcement, EU pulling through their Green New Deal also with climate neutrality, and then a new election in the US. And then people said, are you dreaming? But I think right now this seems to be, again, a likely situation that makes me very hopeful. Together, these three countries make 45% of global greenhouse gas emissions. If they now really pull this through, then there's real hope that it can work. So the one thing that I think needs to happen is they fix it and submit those intentions to the Paris Agreement. That would be then the trigger for other countries to follow. And I think if 45% of global emissions do this, then other countries have no chance of doing the same.
Great. Thanks very much, Nicholas, and thanks, Sophia, for stepping in. So I'm back in time to ask one final question, and then I will give it each panelist a minute to just wrap up with some concluding thoughts. So for the final question, we have, and thank you all for your questions. I apologize that we couldn't get to all of them, is about if we could elaborate on the potential employment impacts by these new interventions. And I was wondering, Deborah, if you'd like to take that one.
Sure, thanks, Claire. Yes, there's multiple benefits of greening the stimulus packages or going the low carbon routes for all the countries. And there's various studies that have been done in many countries. And I think for more detailed responses or interval or impacts, basically, as a result of the green stimulus packages, we've done a piece of research or analysis that was completed for the Petersburg Dialogue in April, and there we include, for instance, all the positive impacts ranging from the reduced air pollution and the health impacts, and what that does also on the health budget and the economy as a whole. The issue around job creation, which is quite a critical one, and yeah, a key one as well. There's also benefits that also talks to energy security and independence. This is important for economic development in many countries, and particularly those countries that do not have their own supply of primary energy. It matters a lot. Another benefit that you can look at is enhanced access to energy and affordability, and economic growth in general if you put all those interventions in place. So multiple benefits, sustainable development benefits basically that one can reap from green stimulus packages.
Great, thanks very much, Deborah. And thank you to all you, all the participants for your questions. We'll now move to the final remarks. So Sophia, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, yeah. Thanks. Thanks everyone for coming and joining the webinar. I would just say, this has been a very interesting research piece. There's a lot happening. There's still a lot on the black box. So, yeah, in general, we strive for more transparency when these packages are communicated, so that we can have a clear view of where we're going.
Great. Over to you, Deborah.
Okay, I think linking to the key messages at the end, I think as I've indicated, we've seen one or two countries that give us hope, going in the right direction. There's still a big concern given the large gap that we still have in emissions. And I think the worrying thing is that we're still not seeing the necessary structural and transformational changes that we need. And I think some of the countries still have the opportunity to basically change the direction in terms of investments that they're making in their recovery packages.
Deborah, Bill, your final thoughts, at least for today?
Well, yeah, I mean, like Nicholas, I'm really heartened by the China announcements. I think the EU has been moving on its improved targets for some time, and its green recovery work is really strong and structural. The China announcement signals that China is prepared to move, and in a direction that few of us would have thought possible a year or two ago. And I think that gives grounds for real optimism. If candidate Biden is elected with a similar commitment to reach zero emissions by 2050 for the US, I think there's the game is fully on then to meet the Paris Agreement goals, which should give everyone hope that we can get this problem well on the way to being, at least the initial stages of being solved.
Thanks, Bill. And so Nicholas, you get the final word.
Yeah, I'm equally optimistic. I watched the climate negotiations for 25 years, and we are doing the temperature updates here for the last 10 years, and you have many setbacks and think, why are things not moving? So a day like today or yesterday with an announcement that moves our temperature estimate by, I don't know, 0.2 to 0.3 in the right direction is totally unusual, and I'm much more hopeful than I have been in many of the occasions before. So this is really good. We know that it all needs to be implemented, but for today, I'm quite happy, and I'm hopeful that we can still make it.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you to all the participants for making the time in this busy climate week to attend our event. The briefing paper is available on our website right now. And we have also updated the Chinese assessment, so that is also available. And we will make the recording of this webinar available off the website as soon as possible after this event closes. And so with that, thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.